Hello everybody, thank you for watching my video. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe. A 14th century writer by the name of John Trevisa gives an insight into the character of English people during the Middle Ages. Trevisa describes people from the south as being mild and easygoing. His description of northerners is altogether less flattering. According to him, people from the north were unstable and more cruel. His views are actually shared by other chroniclers as well, although there are reasons to take his views with a pinch of salt. Firstly, Trevisa himself was from the south, Cornwall to be precise, in the southwest, and so perhaps he was a little biased. Secondly, the subject that we are going to discuss here, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, which happened during his lifetime, was a fireball of rage that exploded in the southeast of England and largely contained there, although there were outbreaks of violence in the north as well. Trevisa makes generalizations, and I tend to find generalizations can be deeply flawed. However, it has to be said, England, whether it's in the north or south, throughout the Middle Ages, could be a volatile place. Civil war in the centuries leading up to the Peasants' Revolt had done untold damage to the country. Prime examples of this being the anarchy of the reign of King Stephen in the early 12th century and the chaos that dominated the reign of King John in the 13th century. And of course, famously, the century after the Peasants' Revolt, we would see a catastrophic period of civil war for England that we now know as the Wars of the Roses. However, there are many other factors that go into explaining why the Peasants' Revolt happened, and it's not simply due to the over-aggressiveness of the English population, whether they're northern or southern. Hence, I'll discuss some of the other possible explanations for the events, discuss whether the revolt could have been avoided, as well as looking at what social impact Wat Tyler and his band of followers actually had. As mentioned already, the revolt took place in 1381, 4 years into the reign of the young Richard II, who was 14 when his capital came under attack. However, to look at one of the main causes of the revolt, we have to travel back over 30 years into the reign of the previous king, Richard's grandfather, Edward III. In 1348, Edward had been king for over 20 years and had already won some great victories in battle, including most famously at Crecy. But even the glorious reign of Edward III will be brought to a shuddering halt when a calamity of enormous proportions befell Europe as the Black Death struck. It had arrived on the continent via a ship which had landed at Genoa, and the deadly disease was soon running riot, devastating populations far and wide. It wasn't long before the disease found its way to England, where around a third of the population are believed to have died. There are fluctuations in the figures given, but the chronicles do paint a grim picture of the havoc the outbreak caused, irregardless of what the actual numbers were. Villages, towns, and cities were torn apart, as there were, in some parts, scarcely enough people left alive to bury the dead. There was a sharp decrease in prices, including that of livestock, as cows, pigs, and other animals were sold in case they too became afflicted with a deadly disease. Indeed, there was a pestilence among sheep, whose population was also seriously reduced. According to one chronicle, over 5,000 sheep died in one pasture alone. This too was grim news, as wool was an important part of the English economy in the 14th century. England was in a truly wretched state, and perhaps unsurprisingly, given the history between the two nations, the Scottish decided that the time was right to invade, as they saw their neighbours in a terrible strife. Perhaps they believed that the plague was a punishment that God was delivering on the English, but they were misguided if they thought they were immune from the disease. And as soon as the invading army marched into England, they too were cut down by both the disease and eventually an English army that was sent to meet them. The expedition was a disaster for the Scots, and frankly, it serves them right. The disease didn't discriminate, although the rich had a better chance of survival by holding themselves up in some country estate somewhere. But Edward III himself lost a daughter to the plague. She had been sent to marry the King of Castile, and she had sailed for the continent, but when she landed at Bordeaux, she caught the plague and died. At a time where families could be totally decimated by the plague, unexpected opportunities began to arise for those who had been used to toil for very little reward. Labourers were now in high demand due to their scarcity. This meant they could reasonably expect to ask for higher wages to carry out their services. However, Edward III moved to curb the rapidly escalating wage increase, and many labourers were arrested or forced to flee from persecution. In 1349, at the height of the plague, the king passed a statute that attempted to force workers to carry out their services for the wages that they were paid before the outbreak, and in 1351 the king went one step further and passed the Statute of Labourers. The statute firmly outlined what wages different types of workers, ranging from those who worked in the field to carpenters, tailors and shoemakers, could realistically expect to be paid or charge for their services. Aside from inflation, Edward undoubtedly had in mind maintaining his aggressive foreign policy against France, and he needed to keep an iron-fist grip on his economy. Without question, this would have caused a tremendous deal of anger across the country, but the efficiency of Edward's government and his officials meant that the king's coffers continued to fill. However, by the 1370s, Edward's health was in decline, and the country started to fall apart. The decline in Edward III's health, as well as that of his sons Edward the Black Prince, saw England lose control of the war in France, which would have had impacts on both the economy at home as well as on the general morale of the nation, and, accordingly, there was now growing discontent. In the Good Parliament of 1376, it was alleged that a number of men close to the ailing king were enriching themselves at the cost of the wider population. Two examples of these include men called Richard Lyons and William Lord Latimer, the latter of whom had been a member of the Privy Council. Both of them were accused of extortion, and the former was imprisoned. Another example of someone taking advantage of the declining political situation was a woman by the name of Alice Perez, who was Edward's mistress. The old king had been left lonely and vulnerable after the death of his queen, Philippa, in 1369, and Alice sensed an opportunity to advance herself, which she did readily. She helped herself to jewels and other riches, with it even being said that she stole items from Edward almost the minute he had died from a stroke in 1377. For Alice, any gain she made from her relationship with Edward was short-lived. She died in poverty. However, what that infamous relationship had shown was how far the reign of Edward III had fallen. Greed and corruption were rife. The once strong governance and law of Edward III was now long gone, and competent officials were hard to come by, as England sought to keep matters in order both at home and abroad. So, by 1377, was the peasants' revolt becoming inevitable? I believe the answer is still no. What England needed now, on the death of Edward III, was a return to the strong rule of the mid-14th century. For around 4 decades, Edward had provided England with exactly that. There had been social unrest in the early years of his reign, which had been dealt with, including one situation in South Yorkshire in the mid-1330s. But the real boiling point could have been after the outbreak of the plague, but thanks to Edward and his lawmen, they managed to keep things in check. However, he was now succeeded by his 10-year-old grandson, Richard II. History had already shown that child rulers often brought difficulties, and so it would prove again. Early in the reign of Richard, it became clear that there was a growing sense of unease in England. One writer of the time believed that there was a growing lethargy and complacency in the upper classes, and supposedly violent common people were, according to this writer, growing far too big for their boots. Ordinary working class people were expected to stay in their lane and accept their lot in life, and that is made clear in many chronicles of the 14th century. But if a revolt hadn't necessarily been inevitable in the dying embers of the reign of Edward III, then it soon would become inevitable in the reign of the new king, with the passing of 3 poll taxes. A parliament was held in early 1377, just months before the death of Edward III, which was overseen by John of Gaunt, Edward's third son. A tax of 4p was imposed on every male and female over the age of 14, with the exception of beggars. A tax was also placed on the clergy. 2 short years later, another poll tax was imposed, with everybody from Gaunt to the ordinary common man and woman expected to pay. In 1380, though, Parliament crossed a fatal line. A parliament was held at Northampton, and here various reasons or excuses for another crippling tax were given by the Archbishop of Canterbury and Chancellor Simon Sudbury. Justifications included paying the wages of English soldiers in Calais and other areas of France who had still not been paid for months of service. The Crown was losing revenue from wool subsidies due to riots in Flanders, one of England's key trading partners in the wool industry, as well as for the general defence of England from foreign enemies. These are some of the reasons given for the third poll tax. After negotiations with the Commons in Parliament, the hated tax was eventually passed and enforced. Work on enforcing the tax began almost immediately in December of 1380. There was to be no slacking, as officials were ordered to enforce the tax thoroughly and diligently, and anyone who refused to pay were ordered to be arrested and duly punished. Records of everyone taxed were to be sent to the treasurer, Robert Hales, and he, like Simon Sudbury, would become one of the chief targets of the peasants' revolt. In the summer of 1381, the southeast of England exploded in rage at the crippling taxation. One of the first sites of note to be targeted by the rebels was an Essex estate owned by Robert Hales. Here they found large quantities of food and drink. They promptly made merry before burning the place to the ground. It is clear, despite how chroniclers of the time might describe them, that this was no unruly mob. They held genuine grievances and made it quite plain who their anger was directly aimed at. Already they had targeted Robert Hales, the treasurer, and now they made their way to Maidstone, which fell under Simon Sudbury's jurisdiction, and there from prison they released a preacher by the name of John Ball, who became, along with Wat Tyler, one of the leaders of the Peasants' Revolt. The role of John Ball as a preacher was crucial in the escalation of the revolt. His speaking ability riled up his crowd of already indignant peasants as he spoke of the evils of the current government and the injustices of the poll taxes which had been inflicted upon them. And word soon travelled of the uprising, and so the people of Essex and Kent were joined by men and women from other counties in the southeast, including Sussex, Bedford, and other areas. The peasants turned their attentions to London, and so it was through Kent they marched, until they happened upon the king's mother, Joan of Kent. Quite what Joan would have thought when she saw this band of men and women marching towards her is anybody's guess, but it's safe to say she would have been deeply unnerved. However, despite being treated with something bordering on contempt, Joan was spared, and she went to join her son, who was now very aware of the dangerous situation that was boiling up. Richard, Simon Sudbury, Robert Hales, and many others had holed themselves up at the Tower of London, where, presumably, they thought they were safe. For some of them, they would be proved to be very wrong indeed. By mid-June 1381, the peasants were in London and causing great damage to the capital. The Savoy Palace was destroyed by the rebels. The palace had been owned by John of Gaunt, the richest man in England, and it was a symbol of his great wealth, whom the rebels hated so much. Indeed, if Gaunt had been in the southeast of England at the time of the rebellion, rather than on campaign in the north, then his life would have been in great danger indeed. As it was, his son, Henry Bolingbroke, had remained with the king, and he had a narrow escape himself when the rebels eventually broke into the Tower of London, and he was only spared by the quick thinking of a Tower guard. As it was, when it came to Gaunt, the peasants had to content themselves with simply destroying his palace. The destruction of both human life and property was terrible. At Cheapside there was bloodshed, as not only men specifically targeted by the rebels were put to death, including a certain Roger Legget, but also completely innocent people felt the wrath of the revolt as well. Dozens of Flemish weavers were seized and had their heads hacked off for supposedly stealing work from English people. As London continued to go up in flames, the rebels marched on the tower and eventually gained entry. The fear that must have gripped everyone in the tower at the time must have been crippling. Among the victims to be seized were Chancellor Simon Sudbury and Treasurer Robert Hales, who were both brutally beheaded. There was nothing professional about the executions either. Numerous blows of the axe fell on Sudbury's neck, and one of his fingers were cut off. His head is now stored, rather than buried, for some reason in a safe at Canterbury Cathedral. Other important men also came a cropper, including the King's physician, William of Appleton, and the King's Sergeant-at-Arms, John Legge. Bearing in mind Richard II was only 14 at the time, seeing men around him being cut down so violently would have had a tremendous psychological impact on him. This in part might explain why his reign would go so wrong later on. However, during this crisis, the king would distinguish himself. With his treasurer, chancellor, and numbers of his other key men dead, the young king would have known that this could not continue. Despite the rebels stating they only wished to speak with the king and wanted to cause him no harm, Richard and his advisers could not be certain of that. But all the same, Richard decided to meet the rebels at Smithfield on the 15th of June. Here, Wat Tyler became embroiled in a scrap with the Mayor of London and was cut down and put to death. In a manner befitting of someone much older than he, the 14-year-old Richard addressed the other rebels and informed them that it was not Tyler who was their leader, but he, the king, who was the one they should be following. And whilst this was going on, scores of men in the employment of the Mayor of London arrived and surrounded the rebels. This extraordinary rebellion was now at an end. The response to the rebellion was predictably brutal, as the leaders of the revolt, as well as scores of other participants, were put to death. The man who had killed Simon Sudbury had rather foolishly boasted about it quite openly, and he was beheaded. Over time, the Crown decided to send a stronger message than simply ordering rebels to be beheaded. The punishment for those from areas like Kent and London was upgraded to a traitor's death. This was to make it plain that such civil disobedience was not to be tolerated. So, what was the impact of the revolt? Undoubtedly, it had shaken those in power to the very core, hence the brutal nature of the suppression. The rebels must surely have known that their demands would never have been granted. But what they had done was awaken a spirit in the lower classes that could now never be undone. In the centuries to come, there will be further rebellions against the crown, including Jack Cade's rebellion of 1450. You could not call the peasants' revolt of 1381 admirable. Some of the violence that came from it was wholly unjustified, but its main goals were understandable. The pressures of taxation had weighed upon the peasants for too long, and they had sent a message that they, the poor, would not simply tolerate oppression from those wealthier than them.